Thank you all so much, and I'll start with a caveat that I am not a medical researcher or a health researcher. I'm a political scientist. I collaborated in this paper with a colleague working in health, but I say that because I think there's a huge amount of value in this interdisciplinary work, particularly for health researchers, and so that's why I wanted to be with you today and try to hear your feedback as well. And so in this paper, we're looking at the impact of food system attacks on child nutrition, evidence from conflict in Nigeria. And I will start by saying, and this won't be a shock to any of you who are familiar with the research on humanitarian crises, that there's a lot of evidence that conflict has detrimental effects on child well-being and child nutrition. Particularly wasting and stunting. So that is not a sort of a novel finding, but what we wanted to do was understand better how particular types of conflict might affect might disproportionately affect health outcomes. And really the rationale behind that is that there's general recognition in research on conflict and hunger that conflict impacts vary. So they vary according to the nature, the intensity, the duration of conflict. They vary according to different types of tactics, for example. It's plausible that different types of strategies and different types of attacks will have different impacts on populations in the vicinity of those attacks. That follows. In parallel, we're also seeing a growing attention in that research to the targeted and often deliberate attacks on food systems, intended in many cases to affect the food security of populations, if not outright result in the starvation of civilians or affected populations. And so we see that whether it's attacks on food resources themselves, whether it's burning of fields, whether it's the destruction of wells, whether it's the destruction of storage facilities, for example. We also see it in attacks on food system stakeholders, something that's less well documented, but attacks on traders, attacks on people who are transporting food, for example, coercion or the threat of violence against them affecting food system functioning. And yet we have this gap in the research where we know a tremendous amount in the conflict research about the nuances and complexities of conflict and violence, and yet most of the research that looks at the nutrition and the food security outcomes treats conflict as an aggregate category. In other words, if there is empirical or quantitative research that's looking at the presence of conflict in a context, it tends to group all forms of violence together and treat them as a single homogeneous category, when the political science and conflict research tells us we have reasons to believe the outcomes would differ depending on the type of conflict. And this isn't only a research question, this is also in forecasting. So when we do food security forecasting and food crisis forecasting, most of those models, if they account for conflict at all, they tend to do so with a straight count of the number of events that have taken place, for example, the number of security incidents that may have taken place in an area. They're not disaggregating between different types of violence. And so we wanted to be particularly attentive to what we're calling food-related violence, that is a violent conflict event in which food and or food systems feature in acts of political violence. That might mean they're the settings in which violence takes place, they're the resources over which violent competition is centered, or they are the target of physical attacks themselves. And we believe and propose in this paper that this type of violence would have an outsized impact on child nutrition. And we have two other sort of, I would say, sort of sibling papers that go with this, where we looked at the outcome, the impact of this form of violence on population-level food crisis. In other words, looking at IPC data, the Integrated Phase Classification System data that says populations, how much of the population is in crisis. And we have a paper that looks at self-reported food consumption, and both of those indicated that this form of violence disproportionately affects food security measured in those ways. What we specifically didn't know was whether that also held for things like child nutrition. So we wanted to sort of take this triangulating approach to say, robust to how many specifications of food security and nutrition can we test this? So identifying and measuring food-related violence is a challenging thing. For those of you who might work in humanitarian response or have worked in that field, you may know that humanitarians are often constrained in terms of what they can report. The access for journalists is often very problematic. Human rights observers and missions that might document this form of violence may not have access for many months or even years. And then you have other forms of biases and data gaps and quality issues that arise. And there is no dedicated monitoring effort for food-related violence. So despite the fact that it's prescribed in international humanitarian law, there is no measure, no data set that sets out to measure this. And there are for some of the other forms of violence, for example, attacks on health systems, which are, I think, in many ways, a sort of parallel form of targeted attack. And so we had to make do with what does exist, which are data sets on political violence that describe the acts to some degree, and use that to try and identify those incidents that have been recorded of political violence that involved some element of the food system within them. There are limitations to this approach. It's not a dedicated monitoring effort, and so we have reason to believe this is underreporting the number of events, for example, although we could discuss that further, the need for that further data. But an example would be the ones you see above you, sort of land seizures, instituting blockages, for example, of towns, resulting in the deaths due to starvation, abduction of civilians, for example, engaged in livelihood activities, food-related livelihood activities, and their livestock. Associated violence associated with food distribution, thank you, and then farms being looted. So that's an illustrative example. We focused here in Nigeria for a number of reasons. Again, we can discuss further, but Nigeria is a context that has a very large economy, and we would expect to see, we would maybe expect to see greater improvement in child nutrition outcomes than we have seen over the past decades, were it not for the concentration of violence, particularly in the northeast of the country. It also has geographically very variable violence, so it's very concentrated in particular pockets, which allows us to look at data and sort of control for that effect and look at its specific effect. So we looked at weight for height of recorded children between 6 and 59 months, surveyed in multiple rounds of the DHS survey. We calculated the number of conflict events in the 365 days prior to the DHS survey. In other words, in the preceding year, how much violence took place in close proximity to these households. We controlled for child, household, and environmental covariates, and ultimately found that food-related violence, though it is rarer than other forms of violence recorded in the data set, was more strongly correlated to subsequent undernutrition, weight for height, and wasting than all other subtypes of violence, or than an aggregate category of violence. In other words, if we are looking to understand the relationship between violence and child nutrition outcomes, it is important for us to consider this specific subtype of violence. So when food systems are attacked, they are done so less frequently than general political violence takes place, but when they are attacked, their child nutrition outcomes are more detrimental. I won't do this table in any great detail, but I'll just highlight for you here. Excuse me. This is our results where we compare different categories of violence, and that includes our sort of odds ratio that shows our food-related violence measure has a higher ratio, resulting in the likelihood, a higher likelihood of any impact on, in this case, severe wasting in particular. So I've isolated severe wasting because we also found a scalar effect. In other words, that food-related violence had a greater impact at the more extreme outcome of severe wasting. So to conclude, food-related violence has an outsized effect on child nutrition outcomes. Our findings are consistent with the general direction of findings on conflict-driven hunger, but point to the value of this greater specificity in our measures. This is relevant for food security, nutrition, and humanitarian researchers who are looking to better understand and to forecast conflict-driven food insecurity, as models can be improved through the integration of food-related violence measures. It's also relevant for nutrition and global health researchers, as understanding nutrition outcomes and potentially other health phenomena, and that's what I'd really invite your input on in particular, potentially other health phenomena beyond nutrition can be improved by integrating insights from the conflict scholarship. So we tend to be operating in these silos where we think we know a tremendous amount about conflict, but as I've discovered in this paper, I know very little about health and that side of the research equation. And so we think that this is actually indicative of something larger, which is that insights from the conflict scholarship can help inform stronger predictions, better research, and better understanding for a range of health phenomena in humanitarian crises. And last but not least, and of course this is really critical, this is relevant for affected populations. Accountability measures, peace building, transitions, and a just recovery from conflict involve being able to say that the food security crises that are being experienced and the nutrition outcomes that are being witnessed, and potentially having long-term effects, as we know that is the case for child undernutrition, that those are not incidental consequences of conflict. They are a specific outcome of specific strategies and tactics. In other words, the choice to target food resources is what is driving these outcomes, and not the sort of seemingly overwhelming sort of phenomenon of conflict more generally. A couple of unknowns and next steps. This is my last slide. There's no dedicated purpose-built monitoring effort for this, which means we don't know how well phenomena of food-related violence is captured, and that's certainly a gap. It's unclear to us at this point whether disaggregating further within forms of food-related violence, those with mass casualties or those that co-occur alongside other forms of violence, might be valuable. And we don't know whether attacks on specific parts of the food system are particularly detrimental. And those are 3 directions we'd like to expand further. Thank you all so much.